So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Graham Holden, our Head of Teaching and Learning.
I'll be very quick. Good morning, everyone. Special welcome to all our external guests. I think we've got 46 delegates from other institutions and partner colleges, so especially warm welcome to you. I'm going to very quickly hand over to our keynote. This is the biggest conference we've had here at the university that I can recall for learning and teaching. I think that's because of the relevance of the topic, student engagement, and we couldn't have chosen a better keynote. I did say I would build you up, Simon, I apologise, for this. So those of you who don't know Professor Simon Lancaster, anyone who's on Twitter will know him well. Simon is a National Teaching Fellow. He's also received a Royal Society of Chemistry Teaching Award for Higher Education, which gives you a hint that he's a real scientist, practicing scientist as well, although he does promise me there won't be any real hard science in today's keynote. However, Simon did say in his little note in the programme that he practices what he preaches. So no pressure, Simon, but over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Graham. I'd like to start by, I'm going to start acknowledging what he said. So the theme of this conference is student engagement. And that means that everybody here values student engagement. And you are here with me, and we're going to model some of the practices that I'm suggesting are necessary in student engagement. Now, of course, for that to work, you have got to take the role of students this morning. So this is going to be as engaging as I can possibly make it. But engagement is a reciprocal process, so you need to engage with me, and I'm going to engage very much with you. Okay, so what I would like to start by saying is, and this is going to sound like hyperbole, but I don't want it to be. It's absolutely, it's as sincere as I can be. It's such a privilege to come to Sheffield Hallam University, because I feel like I've been here before, because in many ways I have been here before in a virtual sense, through the Bring Your Own Device for Learning initiative, through the Learning in Teaching in Higher Education chats that happen every Wednesday evening. Some of you may not be aware of just what a high profile your institution has in the higher education web. You have many of the leading voices in social media, in engagement, happening in your institution as we speak. So in a sense, you really don't need me. If you need me at all, then perhaps you need me as a mirror to reflect the fact that what's going on in Sheffield Hallam is so good and so impressive. And so I will make no apologies for various references to members of Sheffield Hallam staff that I'll make during this keynote, because it's true to say that they've inspired many of my practices. I'd like to be regarded as innovation, but if innovation means taking things I've seen happening in Sheffield Hallam and applying it at my own institution, then that's some of the innovation that I'm going to be claiming this morning. We are going to be having a really interactive session. And it is key to me that absolutely everybody is interacting. So often you hear someone talking about lectures in a disparaging sense. So I want to be clear from the outset what I mean when I talk about lectures. So let's start over this side of the spectrum with the monologue, with the academic who comes into the lecture theatre and reads off their slides. Okay, so that's the extreme description of the classic university lecture. Of course, at Sheffield Hallam, nobody does that. Nobody comes into the lecture theatre and reads off their slide. At the other end of the spectrum, what we might have is a truly engaged, problem-based learning session where students have prepared and the academic is there as a guide on the side, helping them through their problems. So on one extreme, we might have the monologue. On the other extreme, we might have a problem-based learning session. Now, we know, hopefully, that most of us will be able to accept that this is not the very best teaching practice. And often when I infer a criticism of the lecture, people's hackles go up, because of course they're not doing the monologue. They're doing some degree of interaction with their students. So they resent the characterization of the lecture as being just a monologue, because that's not what they're doing. So they're somewhere here on the spectrum. What I want to describe this morning is a way by which all of us, that's not just those people who are hugely animated by learning and teaching, that's those people who came to university primarily to do research and find that they need to do some teaching. They're not going to completely change everything they do, and you don't have the resources to have everybody doing problem-based learning. You don't have the spaces, you don't have the staff. But what I want to present is a way that we can move closer to that problem-based learning on this spectrum without having to change our learning spaces, without having to completely throw away all the materials that we had. And so that's my perspective, and that's the perspective of a practicing chemist. I work alongside science lecturers all the day whose day job is to do research. I'm trying to convince them that they need to move towards a more active learning model of their teaching, but they're resistant because they're busy people. It's not because they don't care, it's because they're really busy people. And what I wanted to offer to you is the solution for busy people that do care, but don't have the time or the resource to move straight to PBL. So we are all going to engage. Now, those people who are here on the spectrum might well do what I see lots of my colleagues doing, and that is they'll ask a question of their audience. So I ask a question of my audience, and often it's treated as though it was rhetorical. You know the sort of thing, you ask a question, you're well-intentioned, but nobody replies. More often, one or two people reply. You know the sort of people, the people who sit at the front, the people who raise their hand regardless of what question you ask, the people that I refer to as teachers' pets. Now, we all love teachers' pets, that's why they're called teachers' pets. We're grateful to those people because they vindicate the interaction that we're doing. But what I'm interested in is what happens to the other 95% of the people in the lecture theatre. The people who are not teachers' pets, who don't always raise their hand. After a very short space of time, what happens is that everybody else knows teachers' pets going to raise their hand. They know that's going to happen. And so the question ceases to apply to them. They anticipate teachers' pet answering the question, and they don't bother to compose their own answer to that question. So when I talk about interactivity, when I talk about engagement, I mean everyone. And if I'm going to engage with everyone, I can't just rely on the kind of questions that retire an answer when you raise your hand. I need to use technology. And the reason I use technology is not because I'm a geek. This Apple Watch probably indicates that, yes, I am a geek. I'm definitely somewhere on the geek spectrum. But I am very keen to stress that this is not about technology. This is about pedagogy. And the pedagogy says active learning means everybody is active in learning. So we put the technology in people's hands. So hopefully, most of you have installed the Responseware app. Now, we'll find out in the very near future whether that's the case. So we wanted people to install the Responseware app. And those people who had need only one piece of information. They need that 6-digit code. That joining ID is the only thing that you need to enter when you start up Responseware. When you enter that 6-digit ID, you'll then go to a page that asks you for your name and various other pieces of information. Don't enter them. If you have entered them, it's not a problem, it's not a disaster, but I don't want you to enter them because, frankly, I'm not going to do anything with that information whatsoever. I am very, very interested in what you as a collective body of people say, but I'm not going to probe what any of you as individuals answer to these questions. And it's really important that we understand that because you're allowed to be wrong. You're allowed to have a contrary opinion. You're allowed to express yourself completely freely because nobody is going to follow you up. I'm not going to send this information to anybody. It won't be available in any form. So feel free to answer the questions, even those questions where you think you might be exposing a degree of ignorance. That's absolutely fine. If nobody learns anything, then the whole thing is a waste of time. So it's absolutely fine to be wrong. It's absolutely fine to be controversial. It's absolutely fine to be, constructive. Now, I am going to do something that some people find remarkable, and that is I'm going to invite you not just to use your devices to interact with Responseware, but I'm going to invite you to use your devices to get on social media and to do lots of tweeting while I'm talking. I want you to tweet comments, questions, observations about this keynote presentation, and hopefully that'll set the scene for the rest of the conference as well. You might say, but that's rude. I'm not concentrating on you. Of course you're concentrating on me. Your comments are doing it. But the reality of the way that the human brain works is that nobody here can concentrate for an hour. The ideal length of any teaching session would be about 5 minutes. That includes the coming in and getting out, because that's how long our attention spans actually are. But of course that's not practical. Nobody's going to timetable that. Okay, so I realise that no matter how interactive I try and be, no matter how entertaining I try and be, no matter how much I wave my arms around and strut about and gurn, I am going to switch you off at various points. The challenge for me is to get you back again at some other point. But in that interim, if you're tweeting something like, well, he's lost the plot at this point, that's absolutely fine. I'd like to see that. Now, many of you have got your little notepads and you're writing down notes, and you might be really good at writing notes. You might even be a visual note taker like Sarah, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what Sarah produces. But together we can do a much better job than any one individual can do. So I want us to crowdsource a record of this conference, and in particular this keynote. Don't just describe what I'm doing in your tweets, comment upon it, argue with it, and when I'm on the train on the way home, I'll have a chance to respond to some of those comments. So let's crowdsource a discussion, a record of what's going on. So to the hashtag short 15. Right, why would you want to do anything on Twitter? Well, you know, this pre-keynote, you'll be glad to hear, is not about Twitter. It would be absurd for me to bring coals to Newcastle, the home of Sue Beckingham, and talk about Twitter. All I want to illustrate to you is that what Twitter has done to me. That's my personal Twitter network. Those are people who follow me on Twitter. I haven't been to all of those places, but when I do go to those places, I'll know people there already. That's my network. And that network has played a central role in getting me my chair and getting me opportunities like this. That's what Twitter has done for me. And perhaps Twitter could do something similar for you. Okay, I promise you interactivity. Now, interactivity comes in different forms. This is an ice-breaking type of activity. And what I know is that not everybody here has got Responseware running on their device. So what we need are a couple of volunteers. I think Andrew's going to do it, and maybe Jackie. So if you're not running Responseware and you don't have any way of doing so, then you're going to need a clicker. So if you can raise your hand, then we'll distribute them. If you do have any means of installing Responseware, then I please invite you to do this, because this is by far the largest audience I've given a session like this to, and so I only have about 50 of these devices. So if you can install it, please do. Okay. Okay, so those people with your hands still up, I have to apologise to you. I have 300 licenses for the Responseware app, which I arranged, but I only have about 50 physical clickers because I had to bring them from Norwich. So if you're not in possession with one of these devices, then hopefully you're near someone who is, and you will be able to consult. What you will do is you will clearly see this process in action. We certainly have enough people. Okay, so here's a question. It's a bit of an odd question for this session, isn't it? But let's just answer it, shall we? Let everybody who's in a position to answer this question, if you could do so. The first observation I would make, obviously I've taken up time distributing the clickers. But the first observation we have to make as educators is that when you pose a question, it takes time. If you're going to ask a question of your student body, then that process takes time. So whenever you add interactivity, you are consuming time. And that has consequences. If you believe that you need to interact with your student body, then you've got to make time for that to occur. So that's the first observation I would make. Okay, so we've got about 90 responses. Now we ought to be able to manage, well, you know, hundreds. Okay, so some people are saying that they need the ID number again. Okay, so this is the ID. So if you've just installing Responseware, that's the ID that you need. Okay, now I am going to move on from this question because there will be other questions. So, okay, if you have not... Okay, right. I am going to move on. So this is your answer to this question. Okay. So, interestingly enough, we have paired at 39%, strongly agree and agree. So most people here agree that Elvis Presley was charismatic. Well, I'm going to say nothing more about that at this point in here. So what am I going to do? Well, I've highlighted this already. We're going to start off with this notion of lecture capture, which you are on the cusp of doing, as I understand it, at Sheffield Hallam, and you have some facilities to do this already. I'm going to move on to address some of the issues associated with that, and then how we can involve our students in producing resources for us to assist. Well, then see, what matters to me is not lecture capture per se, it's what you can do because you're capturing lectures. That's what matters to me. Then we're going to look at a pedagogy that works in a space like this, called peer instruction. And then I'll finish, probably I won't have time, but I'll finish by the suggestion that if you're struggling to find questions for these type of pedagogies, then actually the students are the best source of this. So, I started off by commenting upon the lecture. And so you might recognise this space on the slide. It looks very different to me now because it's filled by bodies. But we have these spaces. We absolutely have these spaces, and we can do so much more with them than the traditional lecture. First of all, I guess some of the things that are coming along is that you can start recording it. Now, you have many of your largest lecture theatres are set up to capture the lecture. Now, what does capturing the lecture normally conjure up an image of? It conjures up an image to me of someone capturing the slides, capturing the audio, and with a video camera placed at the back of the lecture theatre with a panoramic view of the lecturer strutting about and waving their arms in the air. Okay, that's what lecture capture means to me. Now, if it's a group of students that you tend to be familiar with, then there's a real question about what's gained by actually having the picture of the academic waving their arms around and strutting about. What does that actually add to the process? If you're going to get good lecture capture, I would argue actually you need a good cameraman. And more than that, you need a cameraman who knows what you're going to do next. Now, you will have picked up that I haven't got a clue what I'm going to do next, okay? So how the cameraman can possibly know is a very difficult question. If you look at these MIT videos, total lecture capture things, there are two cameramen taking pictures from different angles, and there's a storyboard and a production team. None of us have resources to do this properly, to zoom in on the whiteboard when we start writing. That's very difficult to capture that. In most cases, I would suggest to you, you don't need to capture that. All you need to do is you need to capture what appears on the screen synchronized with the audio. And all that takes is a microphone like this one and a computer running a piece of software. And so you can do it in any space at any time, and you have control of the process. And so what I've done is use Camtasia Studio in the past. So let's think about these two aspects. So I'm talking about that. I'm talking about either screencasting or the whole camera setup. What do we regard as being positive elements of doing that? What do you regard as pros of having lecture capture available to your students? Okay, so we've got so many of you that when it gets to about 120 responses or so, I'm going to click on. Now, there are a lot more of you who can answer than that. The reason I'm saying that is because I want us to get a feel for the answers in the room relatively quickly. I want everybody to respond, and there are questions later where I'll give you a bit more time. Okay, now this is a question where those of you using the app will recognise that you can answer more than one of these. You don't have to pick a single answer. The technology allows you to choose more than one from a range like this. Okay, so what I can do is I can normalise this to absolute numbers of answers. So what we've seen here is that people regard lecture capture as a learning aid and as a revision aid primarily. And of course they are. Think of your international student or your student with a learning difficulty. What better way than for them to be able to play the lecture back at their own pace, to listen to the bit that they didn't clearly understand as many times as they like. And only the bit that they didn't understand. They don't have to play the whole thing, they can choose the bit that they want. So yes, it's a really powerful learning aid. Illness contingency. Well, interestingly enough, I have a bit of a cold today, but if Andrew believed that it was possible to substitute for a live experience with a recording, then he wouldn't have invited me today. I could have just sat in front of my computer in my office and sent you a video message. Okay? So screencasts are better than just providing the notes. But don't let an accountant, don't let anybody tell you that you can substitute for a live lecture theatre experience with a screencast. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. I've lots to say about these other ones, but not a lot of time. Okay, so here's another slightly different question. This is the flip. Which of these do you regard as disadvantages of capturing lectures? Okay, well, we're nearing on that magic number, so I'm hovering over the button. Answer now. So let's normalise that. Okay, so this is interesting. The most popular answer there is that it discourages lecture attendance. This is fascinating. I'm glad you answered that, because what I believe discourages lecture attendance, or let's be more specific, discourages attendance at timetabled contact hours, is timetabled contact hours that you don't actually have to be there in order to get all the benefit from. Now, there is an expression my colleague David Reed at Southampton uses, and it's what could go online should go online. So if all you are doing is reading out the slides, then most of your students, I think you'll find, can actually read, and they don't need you to read out the slides for them. So I'm using that extreme example. But what I'm saying to you is, if you're not adding anything to the contact experience by everybody being present, then you're missing out on an opportunity, and your students are not silly. If you don't incentivize by making it worthwhile your contact hour, then it can be hardly surprising that the students don't turn up. So what do? I put all of my notes, all of my recordings of my lectures online at the very beginning of the academic year. And I say to my students, if that's what you think the contact hour is for, there's the material. But we're going to have these contact hours, and we're going to do something a lot more than collecting notes. I think it was Mark Twain who's accredited with the expression that a lecture is for transferring the notes from the notepad of the lecturer to the notepad of the students without it going through the brains of either party. Okay? We have virtual learning environments for that nowadays, okay? We don't need to drag students in at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in order to do that kind of thing. So, interesting, absence of charisma. Now, the reason I posed that question at the very beginning of this course was to address this issue. There is, first of all, a misunderstanding about the role of charisma in learning and teaching. So, let me ask you a question. If I was to mumble and never actually engage anybody in eye contact when I was presenting, Or if I strutted across the stage and told you lots of exciting anecdotes about last night in the pub and the fruit beer that I enjoyed with Andrew Middleton, which one of those would you regard as being the most effective lecturer? The shy one? So show of hands for the shy one. Okay, show of hands for the charismatic, entertaining one. Yeah. So a lot of you are raising your hands. Now the word I used here very carefully was effective. The most effective lecturer. The answer is they're both equally ineffective. We need to distinguish between the sort of thing that gives us good module evaluation scores, good NSS scores, and the sort of thing that leads to good learning outcomes, the sort of thing that gives us good honours. They don't have to be different. They don't have to be, there doesn't have to be a lack of overlap, but they are most definitely not the same thing. So the supreme irony for me on occasions like this is that I get invited to give keynotes where my main message is don't lecture. Why is it me who gets invited to do these things when I strongly believe that lecturing is not the answer? And the reason, of course, I guess, is that I'm throw this in performance element into it. So hopefully, I come across as being entertaining. But I don't want to be judged on how entertaining I am. What I actually want to be judged on is 6 months, 12 months later, are you adopting any of the pedagogical innovations that I'm suggesting? Okay? That's what really matters, and that's what's parallel to the learning outcomes for our students. Okay, so why absence of charisma? Well, 24 of you said that charisma is not represented in a recording. And yet, overwhelmingly, everybody said that Elvis Presley was charismatic. Who here has actually seen Elvis Presley live? Nobody. So we don't need to see Elvis Presley live to believe that he's charismatic. I just point that out as an interesting observation. So we have two issues with well, the other thing I want to say about when we produce our screencasts, we put them online. Now, how do you imagine students use them? Well, what they do is they use them just before the exams. You'd expect that as a revision aid. What's wrong with students using these things as revision aids just before the exam? Well, the problem is, we know what we mean by just before the exam, because what we observe is students watching a box set of screencasts of the lectures, presumably with a pot of coffee and an enormous great box of popcorn, for 10 hours the night before the exam. Now, nobody here thinks that that's a sensible revision time. The student can say, oh, well, I did 10 hours of preparation for this exam. But that's not a sensible use of these resources. And of course, the other thing is that we lose the interactivity when we do that. And so what we've created are something that we call vignettes. So this is a vignette. Now, incidentally, has anybody here ever demonstrated the internet live in a lecture theatre? Show of hands if you have. Okay? Has it ever gone wrong? Keep your hands up if it's ever gone wrong. Don't do it. Don't do it. Show a screencast. Show a screencast. Just record the thing working exactly the way you want it to work and show that. So that's what this is. This is a screencast of what is in fact a screencast. So we're getting a bit meta. And of course, this is being captured. So we now have 3 layers of recordings going on top of this thing. So this is our vignette. And what I'll do is I'll drag it along to about 1 minute so that you can see what goes on in these things. Electronegativity is defined by Linus Pauling as the ability of an atom in a molecule to attract the bonding electrons towards itself. Now that's in contrast to a different property which is known as electron affinity. Okay, so that's a recording. But this is the key addition here. We take the take-home message from the lecture and we put back some interactivity. And these things are not completely unrelated, but one is the ability of something to... So a vignette is a shortened version of a screencast with added interactivity. And this is what the students say about them. So we have to remember that all of these comments are positive, and there aren't any negative comments. These are representative comments. But what we have to remember is that we're basically saying to students, here's an additional resource. You can take this additional resource, you can use it or not. The decision is yours. And these things are devised to help with the revision process more than anything else, rather than students watching box sets of these things. And they love them. They really love doing them. If they don't like them, they don't use them. So let me ask you another question. Why do you ask your students to prepare and present presentations? Okay, now there may well be more than one answer that you want to give to this question. I'm assuming if you put A, then that's the only answer you're going to give to this question. Okay. Okay, no, it's interesting because I was told on Turning Point Cloud that would never happen. Who's got an iPad? Who's got an iPad? Can you see the results? Yeah. Okay, so Andrew, can you hold that up? So the most popular answer there is B for employability skills. Yes, of course. This is Sheffield, Hallam. Of course you get your students to prepare and give presentations. I have to tell you that my primary school, my daughter when she was 6 years old at primary school, was also asked to prepare and give presentations. And she took the additional step of creating a screencast. So in 2010, my 6-year-old daughter created a screencast of her presentation and then submitted that as her homework. So that kind of puts these things in context and how we can do them. We believe that this is a really valuable thing to do. But what I'm suggesting that we can add more value to this process. How about if we follow this 5-step program here? How about if we say that the presentation is not the end of the process? Let's say we're going to ask our students to take their presentation, which they've delivered to their peers, to edit that presentation and to turn that presentation into a vignette. Now, what does that add to the process? Well, it adds a lot of transferable skills in video editing. It adds all the pedagogical skills of the old adage, the best way to learn something is to teach it. That puts that in the hands of our students, so it's really valuable in doing this. You may well have found that if you do peer assessment of student presentations, okay, if you do peer assessment of student presentations, then you find that students are very polite about them and give everybody high marks. Of course they do, because there's nowhere to go with it. But if you make this an intermediate step, then students then have a reason to provide constructive feedback to improve the final outcome. And then they do that. And so what we find is that students vote with their feet and they use these resources. So I have a question for you. When was the exam? And this is a throwaway question, so I'll answer this one very quickly and I'll press the button quite quickly. When do you think the exam was? Okay, so I don't know how well you can read this. This is December, January, February, March, April, May. Okay, overwhelmingly, people are saying it was mid-April. So this is, remember what these are. These are student-authored resources. Student-authored resources that students are using to prepare for their examinations. So they use them to prepare for their examinations. But look at this. Look at this phenomenon here. I call this post-mortem viewing. And this is basically students saying that not only do I believe I can revise from these resources, I can actually tell where I went wrong in the examination and estimate my marks based on these resources. So what you find is you get a mixed bag now. Students say these things are really quite difficult to produce, and the standard is very variable. In fact, the standard is not as high as the standard produced by the academic lecturers. Okay? Now, when I set out to do this, I didn't expect this outcome, but it makes perfect sense. Ask You're just about to start screencasting in a big way your lectures. That will give you a little bounce in the NSS because it's new, it's good. What happens after a generation of students where they've come in and they've never known any different? All of their lectures have always been captured. It will be like the VLE. It will be something the students take for granted. If you don't want your students to take your wonderful learning resources for granted, invite them to make some of their own. It has all sorts of benefits, but one of the benefits that it has is that they will appreciate the work that you're doing for them so much better. Right, what else can we do with these screencasting? Well, I want to talk about this idea of lecture flipping. Now, there's lots of stuff about, first of all, you will have heard of lecture flipping, many of you, and some of what you will have heard will be good, and some of what you will have heard will be bad. And that's absolutely as it should be, because nobody should characterize an entire approach by a single example. You wouldn't do it for anything else, so don't do it for an innovative pedagogy that you hadn't heard of before. Lecture flipping is not a recipe, it's a concept. It's a concept that says just giving monologues of content in your lecture space together is not a sensible use of anybody's time or indeed the resource. Take the content out of the contact time and free up the contact time for something more rewarding. That's the basic premise of flipping. Now, how do you go about that? Well, you can ask students to read a book. Yeah, old-fashioned, but in the humanities, of course, that's exactly what you do. Read a novel and come along and discuss it in a seminar. That is the model that is, an anathema to many in the sciences and other disciplines. Okay, so you can ask them to read a book, you can ask them to look at open educational resources, you can ask them to look at screencasts of previous year's lectures. So I told you I'd give you a pragmatic model of doing it. So you want to try flipping, but you don't have a lot of time to sit in your office and create new resources? Don't. Year 1, record your classic teaching materials. Year 2, use those as the raw materials for your flipping. That's the kind of pragmatic approach that I'm suggesting we have. And then, of course, there's the question of what do you actually do in the lecture theatre? You might have a space like this, and I'm so glad we're in this space now, because this is the best way to illustrate it. You might have a large group in a classic space like this. How can you use active learning pedagogies in a space like this? So, what do? Well, I get them to interact, and I'll throw the kitchen sink of interactivity. We've had clicker questions, but we've also had hand-raising, answering questions here, and I'm a chemist. There's not much chemistry in this, as you've already picked up, but chemistry cannot be reduced to always multiple choice questions. I need people to be able to draw structures. I need people to be able to balance equations, and you will in your subjects as well. So I use Lowtech solution. Whiteboards. You scribble on the whiteboard and you hold it up. So only the lecturer can see it. It's a really low-tech solution, but it works and it delivers the kind of interactivity we want. So this is the kind of profile I get. This is a profile for a screencast that I've asked my students to view in advance. And so you look at a profile like this, and normally this is different from most VLEs, because normally the big peak of activity would be somewhere over here on the curtain when the exam is. This is students viewing these resources immediately before the actual flip session. And this is what students say about the flip sessions. So I don't have a lot of time to talk about all of these, but these are, again, representative. I don't have many students who comment on these things. There are 1 or 2 students who come up to me afterwards and say, you're a good lecturer. You don't have to do this flipping thing, okay? I'm someone who cares about the teaching that I'm delivering. Now, maybe I don't need to do the flipping thing to get evaluations, but I have to mark the exam papers. And I am tired of marking exam papers where students say the lectures are good, but don't understand what I'm trying to teach them. So this is not about a recourse of someone who can't lecture. This is about somebody trying to make a difference in the time that they have available to them. So you get lots of really interesting comments, and number 4, of course, is extraordinary. For those of you who are at the back, it says, the flipped lectures are a definite step in the right direction, away from archaic lectures with little or no mental stimulus, towards a more interactive learning experience that maximises learning outcome. Yes, that is a student evaluation comment. But for me, I'm really interested in things like 3. It says, I really enjoyed the flipped lectures and find that revising that material is much easier. Yeah, of course it is, because you actually learned something in the first place. Too often, revision means taking that big pile of notes and cramming them for an exam. That's what revision means to our students, because that's what they've been doing throughout their throughout their education experience. So for me, some of these comments are really quite telling. 6 is very interesting because it basically says lectures are to be survived. That's my extraction of 6. Now, the other thing that people doing flipping, or one of the things that people doing flipping, is you've got all this lovely technology. You've given out all these lovely clickers to your students. So you think, right, I'm going to get my money's worth. I am going to throw in as many questions as possible into my 50-minute contact session. That is utterly the wrong strategy to take, because those questions are throwaway questions. They are questions that don't actually deliver any improvement in the learning of the students. They may check the students done the homework, but they are useless. You want questions that actually facilitate some learning taking place. So here's a classic Bloom's taxonomy. Now, I like this version of Bloom's taxonomy because it's not a classic pyramid. It doesn't imply that creation is the apex of the pyramid in this system. The one thing about this representation of Bloom's I'm confident of is that remembering is at the bottom. Okay? I think remembering is the least important higher education thing that we need our students to do. And yet, look at your exam papers. Look at my exam papers. How much of that is actually intended to be answered by the student remembering what the answers are? We often talk about requirement to have higher order skills in higher education, applying, evaluating, analysing. Quite often, frankly, I'd settle for understanding. Some understanding taking place against my students would be a good thing, and is often, essentially what I'm aiming for. So, let's try practicing some of this. What I'd like you to do, and this time, for those of you who haven't been answering, because they're throwaway questions, it's absolutely critical to the pedagogy that I'm demonstrating that you answer this question. So please, everybody, answer this question on your own in the first instance. The black word is not necessarily intended to be any particular kind of highlight, although it is worth highlighting that particular word in this sentence. It's just so it shows up very well on the green background. Okay? So when we shed body fat, most of the weight exits the body through perspiration, defecation, exhalation, and urination. Which of those are you going to choose? And you need to choose one. You can't have more than one. So what I want you to do is to answer it on your own in the first instance, and then many of you will guess that there'll be a chance to do a little bit more than that in a minute. So we've got 154, 156. I'm going to press the button. Do commit yourself. Nobody's recording your answer. Nobody's going to tell you whether you got it right or wrong. You will be the only person who knows that after this. That is a little bit irritating. Okay. Oh, hang on. Let me just try something. There we go. Right. That's fascinating. Is that not fascinating? Just imagine if you were the teacher posing a question in class and you got that distribution. You'd be like, oh no, they don't get it. They don't get it. Not if you're practicing peer instruction. If you get a distribution like this and you're practicing peer instruction, you rub your hands together and you say, this is perfect. This is a real opportunity. And then what you do is you say nothing except turn to someone next to you, and this is why this works in spaces like this. Turn to someone next to you, someone behind you, someone in front of you, and explain to them why you are right and while they are wrong. And don't take it on the chin. Fight back. basically. Why are you right? Why are they wrong? Let's have some argument in this space. So, you know, for it. Okay. Now, one of the worst jobs that you then have to do is to interrupt it. Now, often people say, well, when do you stop? You know, sometimes you can hear a change in pitch when people stop talking about the question and they start talking about lunch or something else. I didn't hear that change in pitch at all. I think I've probably interrupted you in mid-conversation. And it's probably a conversation you didn't expect to have this morning. Okay? Now, I'm going to just make the point, before we see what people have said, that it's quite challenging setting a peer instruction question like this, because the idea of the question is that we've achieved aim one, which was to split everybody. I didn't want a situation where everybody immediately knew the right answer to this question. But we do need a situation where there are enough people who do know the right answer and they can express it in a compelling fashion to explain that, and so for this pedagogy to actually work. Okay, so at that point I'm saying nothing except answer the question again, please. Right, so we had about 166 answers last time. Let's see if we can. So if you answered it the first time, for comparison's sake, please answer it this second time. I'm hovering over my button. Okay. So there is our distribution this time. And this distribution has changed. And if I had that distribution in a classic teaching session, what I would do at this point is I'd feed in, I wouldn't tell them the answer. I would feed in a key piece of information and then I would send it back to the students for another round of discussion. Okay? However, we don't have time for that, so I'm going to tell you at this point what the right answer is. So there are 4 steps here. You pose the question, you get the students to discuss it with another, you poll them again, because these committing stages are important in the process, and then you explain what the right answer is, so that in some cases you might be getting the right answer, you might be getting the right answer for the wrong reasons. Now, here, are there any biologists or biochemists in here? There are a few of you. I originally posed this question with the word respiration as option 3. And the biologist said to me, no, that's not respiration. Actually, this process is, to many of us, and if you're a medic, then this process that we're discussing here is also called respiration. So breathing in and out is called respiration. Right, so where does the fat go? Well, if you're going to lose fat, then there is only one option. The fat has to be burned as the energy supply in your body. So it is a catalyzed reaction between the fat and oxygen, catalyzed by enzymes in the body. There is no other way of losing fat. It doesn't come out in your sweat. It doesn't come out when you urinate. I mean, it'd float on the surface, wouldn't it? You know, it doesn't come out when you urinate. It doesn't come out when you defecate. If you take diet pills, they stop food being absorbed by your body, so your body is forced to consume fat. They don't flush the fat out of the system, no matter what the advertising claims may do. So, the answer to this question is 3. Now, I'm told I'm running out of time. So, I'm going to pose one last question for us to finish, because I love these questions. But what I would say to you is that the key here, and the key for us if we want to practice this, is where do we get the questions from? And so what I would say to you is what I often do is I ask my students, where are you having difficulties? And they'll tell me, and we'll pose a question based in that area, or I use an online platform like Peerwise to generate the questions, or what I often do is actually I pose the question and I crowdsource the answers. So I ask people, what should we put as options A, B, C, D, and then we vote upon those options. So those are various ways that you can get at the questions. And of course, you've been teaching for years. You know where the misconceptions are. You know how to pose questions like this, but you might want more of them. Right, so let's finish with this question. And this question is, which one of the 3 little pigs built the most environmentally sustainable house? Was it little pig A, using straw, little pig B in the medium of wood, or the bricklayer pig 3? Which pig? Okay, so answer it on your own in the first instance. Okay, so I'm gonna take a quick straw poll, excuse the pun. So, there's our beginning answer. Now you can have that conversation you've been itching to have with the person next to you. Quite the buzz. Sorry? Yeah. Okay, that wasn't nearly enough time. I want to make one observation before we move on, and that is that, gosh, you're noisy, and it's brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. The best thing for me is when the lecturer next door comes in to complain. I love that. I say, go and speak to the VC. He's happy with what I'm doing, basically. So, you know, it's great to have that buzz that's actually taking place in there. So let's answer the question again, okay? You haven't had long enough to discuss this, but please, let's answer the question again, and we'll see where that takes us. Right, I'm going to press my button. So, if we look at that distribution, what do we observe? Well, actually, it's shifted a little bit, but it hasn't shifted very much. And we haven't, you know, we've got 3 answers this time, but one of them is the most popular. Why did I pose this question? Well, I can't tell you what the right answer to this question is. I don't think there is one. I think you can make a really good case for each of these mediums as being the most environmentally sustainable one. And that's the point. People will say this pedagogy will only work where there's a definitive correct answer to the question. And I would say to you, no. What am I trying to achieve? I'm trying to get people learning from each other, discussing things with one another. That's the only thing I do. So those bits of this presentation where I posed a question, handed it over to you, stood over here and said nothing, were the most effective parts of the presentation. That's what we have to realise. That it isn't about how charismatic we are, it isn't about our presentation. Our job is, and it sounds like playing with words, but our job is to facilitate learning. As Phil Race would say, and I'm sure many of you would have heard, to make learning happen. We can't inflict teaching on our students, we can just create an environment in which it might happen. So that really concludes my presentation, but I would like to basically say, to have my acknowledgements here, and just to say that a lot of what I've done in terms of basically, we have the flipped model of teaching, but the flipped model, people would say, doesn't go far enough. It doesn't place enough onus on the students to contribute their materials, to source their questions. So that's where flipping roles came in. And the person who articulated that to me, the person who showed me that there was more to flipping than space, was Anne. So I do really want to acknowledge the role that Anne played. So this is coming home in many ways for me, coming home in terms of delivering this pedagogy here. So thank you very much to Anne and all those people who've introduced this, and thank you to you for engaging. Thank you.
There is absolutely no way you can follow that, so I'm not going to even try. But you will have noticed that we had an illustrator, one of our students, and that was an illustration of what Simon's just done. And Simon can see now. Up on the blog.
Sure. So I'll be on Twitter and about to answer any questions, but I realise you're running very close to schedule.
Do our questions on Twitter. I think I've sent some. Our next session starts in 5 minutes.
Thank you.